Welcome to the Healing Collective podcast, where we explore the paradox of healing.
And we broadcast all of the healing codes to support a world of more heart-centered humans. Today we talked to Bethany's friend Greg, who is a somatic experiencing therapist, and we start by as per usual, Lauren getting support on the podcast to settle my nervous system, and he was just like a genius at that, and I felt so cared for and supported. But then we transitioned to recognizing that we have really similar passions around consciousness, the Map of Consciousness by David Hawkins, and do this kind of full circle conversation about how the collective is in a process of healing and starting their own hero's journey, and how somatic experiencing therapy and healing the body is such a mirror for how we heal ourselves collectively and at the level of consciousness. So I hope that you enjoy it.
Lauren, this is Greg.
Hi.
Hi, Lauren.
This is Lauren, my best friend / podcast co-host / coach each other and just kind of like do life together as much as you can do that when you don't live in the same place. But,
sure.
And this is Greg. Greg is, he's a therapist, and he is a somatic experience practitioner. I met him because he's one of the facilitators and assistants in the 2-year program that I just did. And I've done some individual sessions with Greg too. And a little background on him: he runs a facility, a 108-bed facility. Is that right, Greg?
It's hard to keep track of how many beds. Actually, we just opened 4 new houses, and they're adding beds like it's going out of style. So,
got it.
It's a lot. It's in the mid to low mid hundreds, depending. I'll know more in May.
Got it. So it's an addiction treatment program that has a very high focus. Like every patient gets an option, I think, at least for somatic experiencing support on a weekly basis. Is that right?
Well, we have a trauma department, and we do a lot of training for our clients. We found it pretty difficult to staff the trauma department lately. So lately we have not been able to offer everybody an individual trauma component as we had been for a couple of years. But, the definitely a lot of focus with our primary therapists on getting them trained and sort of literate with trauma work, and kind of moving in that direction.
Got it. So that's a little bit about Greg, and he's got a lot of great tools, persona-based work and all kinds of nervous system things. And my experience of Greg has been a lot of presence and a really slow, open-hearted, calm, co-regulation with him when I've been working with him. And we haven't had somebody on yet who has a lot of professional experience around somatic experiencing, aside from, everything that I've been learning and sort of talking about. So kind of wanted to talk about that, but I also just kind of wanted you guys to meet too and see what kind of alchemy wanted to come through.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. I'm looking
it's
forward
great
to be here.
I just wanted to check in. I'm doing a little better now. I just took a nap, but I'm having a rough day and some Mercury retrograde stuff. And my son just texted me that they had a walkout at school. And so there's just a lot of things that they the student population decided to walk out to revolt against COVID policies and coming back to school. Wow. Now he's saying that they locked the door at school. So I'm I am not in my full presence in this moment. If you don't mind, I just want to text him. My sister is near him, so I think it's going to be fine. But
sure, take care of what you need to take care of. And
that's for real. Absolutely.
That's part of why we booked 2 hours, Greg, so that somehow in there we get like a nice solid hour, and sometimes things happen. Well, yeah, Lauren, take care of whatever you need to take care of.
Yeah, I booked a little more than 2. So
okay.
If we have to delay, we can do it.
Well, I'm good now. It looks like, so I think I would love to do a presencing to start, if that would work. Just for me, I would like to take a couple minutes of breath and silence to just center myself. And if that's supportive to either of you, I would just welcome you to do that also.
Oh, I love that idea.
And whenever it feels good, just come back to the space. What is this somatic experiencing? Isn't the word that you all use like resourcing yourself? Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then can you tell me how you define it? What is that?
You know, when I'm working with a client on resourcing, what we're doing is we're trying to create a container, right? So if you think about a deeply traumatized psyche is one without a container. And so any sort of stimulus will be met with a response, and the response will be often very strong, right? I have a stimulus and I'll move into fight, flight, or freeze very quickly. And resourcing allows a container to get built that gives us at least a delay, right? And eventually it'll even give us some guardrails. So I think about it like driving on a mountain road, for example. My job in a session is to keep people between the guardrails so they don't go off the edge. And after I do that for a while, then they learn, oh gosh, I can actually run into some of this material and have it be okay. Because what happens without resourcing is I get habituated to the fact that certain stimuli are going to overwhelm me and send me into uncomfortable places for a long period of time. And I think, well, that doesn't sound like much fun. So I go to great lengths to avoid those stimuli. But the problem is the stimuli tend to expand because our nervous system is an association machine. And so at first I don't, go out to the movies because the theater is too much. And then I stop going out to the mall because the people are too much. And then I stop going outside of it completely, right? Because I'm continually trying to basically make the world smaller and smaller, because for most of us, that's our first resource, right? It's just controlling the world, controlling exposure. And,
yeah, that's really helpful.
Oh, good.
Well, because what came up is like, what I'm noticing myself today is that I had some type of kind of a trauma response today, and I haven't had that in so long that the contrast to the experience I've been having is so large. So what I'm recognizing is that I've been taking for granted how resourced I've been, and also how many resources it takes for me to hold that container. And I got in a situation where not a lot, but like, let's say 5 different things that resource me regularly are not available or not stable or not reliable. And then so that's what you're describing of like losing my container and just like melting. It really felt like almost like just like if I was water, I was in a container with water and I just spilled everywhere. So I really like that. And it's just got me really reflecting right now on how many resources I need and what I'm resilient to hold, And I think before, like I used to work a job that was 60 hours a week and brutally intense and crisis. And I would have said like, I can handle so much, and I was so under-resourced. And
Sure.
I'm noticing some guilt or some sadness that I feel so heavily resourced, but my resilience feels so much lower. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are, you mentioned there are 4 or 5 that aren't working for you right now. What are some of the ones that are sort of coming through for you or showing up in a way that is helpful?
You said, what resources right now
are here? You're saying like 4 or 5 things that you normally have aren't available. So he's
right.
asking are.
Yeah. What is that? Well, my sister is physically here. Like, so there's a person that's not normally here. And like I was able to take a nap because one of the resources I lost is sleep. Sleep is like a big one for me.
Yeah.
And, she was able to like do some things for me, in the wake of me not being able to hold everything together. Even right now, she's near my son. She's helping facilitate that whole thing so I don't have to leave. And if normally she lives in New York, so if she wasn't here, I would probably have to end this call and go, pick him up or whatever.
So she's really showing up for you.
Yes. And well, I don't want to detour too much because your question was really good, but I feel
this isn't a detour.
You're right on track, sweet.
No, I feel guilty. Great. I feel guilty because it's not because I don't feel like I deserve to be resources by her, but I feel like so often she's a resource for me. And almost like maybe when she's around, my system is like, oh, somebody can help you. And then I don't end up being as much a resource for her, or I tend to feel like I'm adding to her plate.
Oh, so I think what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm getting it wrong, I always tell my clients, I basically just make shit up for a living. So if I blow it, just tell me, I don't mind.
That's what podcasts are too. But well, it's saying all the shit that you believe.
I'm hearing you talking about the idea that when your sister's around, because she's a resource, it allows your system to settle a little bit. And sometimes that brings up material that otherwise you might not have access to. And sometimes the consequences of bringing up that material are challenging or, present some difficulty for you. Does that sound about right?
Yes. And I'm reflecting on, go ahead. Do you want to keep going?
I was just going to say that tells you how safe I'm making up then that your sister is very safe for you.
Yes.
And was safe for you as a kid growing up or no?
Well, that's the thing. I'm 14 years older than her.
Oh, fun. Okay.
So in our adult life, her role in the family, she has kind of, become like a caretaker of us.
Sure.
So there's a way that I want to be more, I want to support her more. But what you're saying around the safety part is really, really vulnerable. I'm experiencing it as very vulnerable. And the irony, and not irony, but like how the universe works is I really, I'm stepping into a point in my life where I value community and I value communal living, and I'm stepping towards it. Like it's a value I've had, but I haven't practiced it as much. I've really just lived with my son and I for most of my adult life.
Sure.
And like in literally 24 hours, I feel like, I don't know, 24 different lessons around community, and what it's like, both what you're saying, okay, I'm safer, I'm more resourced because there's more people helping. There's also more responsibilities, or there's more people to help, or there's more opinions to hear.
Yeah. I mean, community can be a real double-edged sword that way, right? So on the one hand, I'm safer. On the other hand, intimacy for a lot of us is really, has been a mixed bag, shall we say, had some ups and some downs. And so, moving into community, we have to move through all the stages of intimacy, all the tasks of intimacy. And so we have the initial task of sort of the honeymoon period of getting to know each other. And then we move in group dynamics, they call it, forming, storming, norming, and performing, right? So the forming phase is kind of a honeymoon. And then the storming phase is where we define our norms and how we're going to work together, right? So you guys, it'll be fun because we'll be in the forming stage for most of this podcast, right? We're probably not going to have to have any knockdown drag outs and figure out what the boundaries are and what the rules are. There's not a bunch of material that we have to take care of together in order for us to be safe and survive, right? We're not going to probably run into each other's safety stuff. There's not going to be a betrayal of safety in our time together. I would anticipate not anyway. So the podcast life, I mean, that's a fun way to go. But when we move into community, the first stage is there's sort of the joy of connection. And then we move into like seeing each other for parts that maybe we don't show people who aren't around us as often. And the longer we're together, the more depth we get, the more we see. And the question for most of us, most of the time is, if you really see what's going on here, you're going to take off, right? And so there's this constant push-pull of showing you what's going on underneath me. And but anyway, and then the norming is where we sort of establish some expectations that sort of more or less a box psychologically for one another. And I kind of get an idea that you're going to be who you were yesterday, and the day before you'll be today. And I feel kind of safe. And then performing is when we have an intimate, real connection, and can maybe, assuming we got all the way through those stages, and that's the choice we made. So with your sister, you're definitely going to be in the fourth stage. You know your sister pretty well, I would imagine. But with the rest of the community, can be up and down, right? Sometimes, oh, how fun. Other times, like, how's this going to work?
Well, it made me think about what you were saying about at the beginning around when we go into environments that trigger our, trauma. That's when, we most require a resource. It sounded like you were saying also resourcing can shorten the time that we are in the experience of the kind of like recreation, Sure.
Yeah.
And so, I think like it's interesting because I think that relationships are like our greatest desire and also our greatest trauma in this kind of time in history. And so what I'm reflecting on now, listening to you, is like, I'm walking through a minefield of being a part of a family, whatever my communal triggers are, I'm walking through that, consciously to move in the direction of my values. But, I know what you're saying. You were saying how like we create these safe containers, but it can be like isolating, right? Because it's like, I feel resourced or I feel supported as long as I'm not around other people, or as long as I cut out X, Y, and Z thing. And so I think what I'm reflecting on or seeing is that I'm very highly resourced in a situation where I control my particular area of where I live, my routine. There's ways that I have created resource, but they're not necessarily like adaptable or flexible. If those things are not in place and they are more isolated.
Well, I think a couple things come to mind. One, in SE, when we talk about a resource, there are kind of two kinds of them, right? There's an external resource, and then there's an internal resource. And external resources are helpful, but they're kind of malleable, variable, right? They can come and go. And an internal resource happens when I spend some time with someone's nervous system and we see what happens when they notice things that are working. So if we talk about your sister, for example, where there's a connection and we talk about her taking care of you, you might notice that inside there is a sense of lightening, or a decrease in the overall level of angst or challenge that you might have come into the time with today. Is that true for you, or no? It might not be. It would be typical, but we're also not doing a session, so
Or maybe we are. I'm like, looks like maybe
that's a green light. I was gonna say, like, feel free. We welcome.
Well, yeah. So you can tune in. So notice the part in your body.
I think my sister, the part was my sister. There is a complexity because as much as she can be a resource,
there's an overcoupling. Is my story about it?
Right.
So what's that overcoupling?
So, like, there is a resource and there can be trauma and challenge. And it's like when Jackie's there, both things happen. And so they're kind of like, my story is your nervous system kind of expects both in different ways. And when you say the word complexity, I kind of doubled down on that idea a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a human being. Well, I just thought of maybe one or two that really feels like a consistent resource because human beings are so unpredictable.
Yeah. You have any pets? A dog, perhaps?
I do have pets.
What kind of pets do you have?
I have a mutt with 6 toes. And
That's
a golden.
Awesome. He has 6 toes?
Yeah.
Is it a he or a she?
She's an alien. Her name is Lexi. And then my other dog is a golden doodle. And they definitely, yes, so that would be an example of a place that I resource myself.
Sure. So you got Lexi and who else? What was the other one?
Thor.
Thor. Oh, that's a good name for a dog. Nice. Yeah. They play with each other a lot, or they?
Yeah, they are getting better. Thor's little, or he's like 8 months, so he's.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So he's all over Lexi all the time.
Yeah. Yes.
Lexi's like, oh my gosh, you're a puppy. What the heck?
Mm-hmm. They're getting closer. There's definitely some bonding happening right now at this age.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have one that you connect with more deeply than the other, or you say they're about the same? Or
I would say Lexi. Lexi and I, we're about 8 years in.
Sure. That's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what do you notice happening as we're talking about Lexi?
I can feel similar sensations to what I experience when I'm resourced by her. Right. I feel a little bit of a settling in my chest, and it's almost like I'm imagining my head on her fur and the things like that.
Yeah. And so that settling in your chest is a resource. And what we can do is we can kind of put a bookmark on that sensation. You can come back to it. And if we were going to work together for a while, we'd spend some time there, and it's really interesting to, I'm a classically trained trauma therapist. I learned at a place called the Meadows. They're pretty well known.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
Oh, and back in the day, they had the batakas where you would take the baseball bat and hit it's a covered baseball bat, padded baseball bat. You'd hit the stick and yell and scream. And there's a place for that actually has some merit in SE. They definitely frown on it, but it's a pretty limited utility, so I was really good at, I could find the trauma in people, even if they weren't particularly aware of it, and get them to a point of being emotionally affected by it pretty quickly. In essence, I could find the difficulty and we could get to a session and you would feel like, man, Greg sees me because he figured out some stuff and put some pieces together. Awesome. But what I noticed was that had sort of a limited utility, right? We'd share, we'd get into it, but it wouldn't necessarily shift. It would shift for a while and then it would stop. I always had a sense there was more. And so it's so interesting now in a session, what I'm trained to do is to notice, where is there a source of connection? Where is there a source of settling, right? That's what you did just there. You settled a little bit. When we started out today, you were talking about the challenges that are coming up with your son. And it was pretty disturbing and unsettling. And then we spent some time, with the visualization of the dog and lay it on the dog's chest. It's such a great image, just sitting there, and the system settles. And what we can do over time really get habituated to that experience. And the more habituated we get to that experience,
get habituated to the subtle.
Yeah, totally. And the more habituated we get to that experience, the more it becomes sort of a habit, for lack of a better term. The system, it's like a muscle, and the system flexes it. And once that muscle's there, and I can see my inside as a resource, then I can stop resisting all this other material that's in the body and in the psyche. Really, the body and the psyche are pretty merged together, much more so than we think. You have more neuronal material in your stomach. Well, actually, I had a neuroscientist correct me on this, but I was once told that you have more neuronal material in your stomach than a cat has in its brain. And apparently it's like you actually really have about 2/3 the neuronal material in your stomach that a cat has in its brain. I have a friend from my younger years who became a neuroscientist, and I posted that on Facebook like 10 years ago, and he's like, nope, not true. So, oh, okay, Paul, you're probably correct. Actually, you're a neuroscientist, so a research neuroscientist at that. So, okay, then. Well, thank you. I'll try to remember that. But yeah, the brain, the idea that the brain and the mind are up in your head is kind of. I tell my clients sometimes, say, well, it's kind of old fashioned. Your brain is all over your body. It's all over the place. So anyway, yeah, that's the resource piece. Is a lot of what we do, and spending some time in that really strengthens the psyche and allows it to let other material work through too.
Yeah, the thought I'm having, because I think one experience I'm having is that my nervous system is settled like 90% of the time, which is a really big difference for me in my life.
Yeah, you've done some work.
Yeah, I want to really say that to myself. Like, you've done a lot of work. And this experience today was like actually so shocking in contrast to how settled I felt. And what I'm recognizing from listening to you is I didn't know a path from unsettled, I guess, or whatever you would call that, back to the settled, I'm learning more how to hold the settled. And I think my nervous system has truly healed. So there's like ways that it's just in a settled state more often. But when I got thrown, and then I felt, I guess it's like I felt frail. I felt there was a fragility about it, because what I'm reflecting on is like when you're traumatized and you're regularly creating trauma for yourself, like you're resilient to a lot. You're dealing with a lot of drama and things all the time, right? And you're like, look at all I can handle sometimes, And I think what's also happening as I heal is like I can handle less as my nervous system, or less is like normalized, I guess, that my nervous system is like, no.
Well, I think you might just be noticing the delta because it feels different. And I wouldn't say that that's like a regression or some kind of limitation, because my experience of you is that like when we get unsettled, it's when we get out of like a normal range. Like our nervous system always is kind of in some activation, deactivation, activation, deactivation. It's always kind of moving, and there's a range that feels comfortable. What Greg was talking about at first, when we're making the range really narrow of what feels okay and comfortable, that's when, when we really might recede from a lot of things because only this feels okay, versus when you do a lot of like somatic work or different things, the idea is that your capacity grows. And so the less you're getting into overwhelm on a regular basis or spilling out on a regular basis would point that maybe there's some capacity that's been growing in the system. And it might feel you might notice it quite a bit and feel the discomfort of being in overwhelm when it happens, versus someone who's in a state of overwhelm all the time. You might not notice it and might think you can handle quite a bit because it is like kind of normalized. So
yeah, that resonates.
Does that match what you think, Greg?
Oh yeah, totally. That would have been, another way of putting it is, recovery from trauma essentially is about becoming more embodied. You know what I mean? I'm more present in my body. prior to getting, into some, in my 20s, I decided I didn't have the courage to kill myself. So I decided to become a Buddhist monk. My mom was less than excited about me becoming a Buddhist monk. And so she said, if I find you a therapist who you can see and I pay for it, will you go? And I said, well, if you can find one who's smarter than me, maybe I would go. So I was very humble, pretty humble guy in that time. And so she found a guy, and he was the chair of the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Minnesota. I thought, well, he's probably smarter than me. I'll give it a shot. And I walked into the office that he had. I think I was 21 maybe. And I was just a head. I was just a floating head on a body. This body was a rental car I was kind of borrowing. And over the course of the years between now and then, there have been various times and stages where I have become more and more embodied. And a lot of the times I think, I think I might finally have this thing sort of figured out. Mm-hmm. And for a year or two, it's like, all is well. And then something else, just not in 2021, I found a therapist, coach actually, who would read me and pointed out a bunch of material I was unaware of. And it was really disturbing. And I have spent the time, the work in the meantime, sort of integrating all that stuff, discovering my own like pathological arrogance and pride, and discovering my own really deep fear, right? And so right now, even in this moment, I am in a level of sort of emotional disturbance that, 3 years ago was not happening on a daily basis, right? But I attribute that to just jumping more into my body and becoming more aware. There's only so many layers you can peel off the onion at a time. Otherwise, you end up in the fetal position under the table. You know what I mean? That's, yeah. And that's, so your fragility, the comment, I think actually we're all quite a bit more fragile than we realize. I certainly am more fragile than I wanted to believe. So I can resonate with what you're saying, but that would be, the other thing I think that we don't always appreciate is, as we're on a journey toward healing, we, for whatever reason, we tend to silo our work, right? We get really, really effective in a particular area. And you see this particularly with like spiritual folks who are really accomplished. I had a Zen practitioner I studied under for a couple of years, and he was a monumental Zen teacher. He hadn't done some of his work on sex, apparently. So he made some poor choices in that area. And
you really do that.
Well, it's pretty easy to be tempted if you're, the head of, if you get too caught up in your own stuff, I think. And it was pretty bad. It was pretty awful. And that's a great example, right? So some of us will do a lot of work in our, for me, and one of the things that this first guy taught me was that I was a sex addict. Whoa, that's a big deal, especially when you're 22. Isn't everybody a sex addict?
I'm also a sex addict. That's how I know about the meta.
Oh, welcome. Oh, okay. That's why I went down there to do my training. I was like, I'm going to study with.
And I was going to ask you, because you're so Zen over here. I'm like, my next question after we got done, my part was going to be like, Greg, do you ever have moments of needing to be resourced? Because your field is just like a lake at 4 a.m. That's what your energetic field feels like to me. Okay. So I actually have some really relief with your reveal, and the reveal of your 20s and these different times of being resourced or not resourced. And I noticed the one in me that's like, I shouldn't be coaching people until I get to the place that I am not rocked by things.
Oh yeah. I refer to that as therapist shame. We all have the expectation that we should be further than we are. And I certainly, literally had a session on that this week. So like, what the hell? Shouldn't I be able to figure this out? Well, he laughed at me. No, of course not. That's silly. Yeah. But anyway, go ahead.
like the tagline for this podcast is the paradox of healing. And what we're pointing to is that we're all, the idea that we're all perfect, and we could all use a little help. And, there is a real movement towards something. And part of what we're doing is offering all these different modalities and frameworks and ideas and things that have served us so well so that anyone can have access to it through the pod. So it does sort of say like healing's important and moving towards that, but also acknowledging that like there's no like place you get where you're healed either, and you're okay as you are. And like, so holding that paradox, it comes up a lot. And so, and I hear it a lot from my somatic therapist about healers and people who really stand for this and people who want to be of service burning themselves out really bad because they are good at being of service and aren't so good at taking care of themselves. And she's like, well, would you rather be of service for 40 years or 4 years because you go too hard and burn yourself out? And I think we create a lot of pressure because we care. And there's just like a big shadow side to it all. I mean, I'm in the middle of that. That's what I'm up to is,
shadow work.
Yeah. And just like, well, the shadow specifically of working a lot and being in community with a lot of people. So I've built up like the expectations of like energy output level, space holding time beyond what is really friendly for my system, and not really sure what to titrate down. So kind of that's my current exploration. And the thing I'll do, my version of shame is like, you should be able to handle this. You shouldn't really need this off. You should be able to, stuff like that.
This is my son who did a walkout and brought me Starbucks.
Multitasking. Hey, Taylin.
That's a pretty good plan right there.
The world today.
How is that for you that your son brought you some Starbucks?
Really, actually so good. Like and I noticed how food was like such a thing, but I immediately, I'm thinking about so many things. I don't want to jump too far, Bethany, from what you're sharing.
I feel complete. Let's tell us what you're thinking about.
Well, first, maybe just notice what happens inside the nervous system as you notice your son really being very thoughtful.
Even being physically here. Like I just noticed so much. I noticed joy and tears, and just like when he's physically here, it's like what I love about him is like, I don't feel like I want anything from him, or need anything, but just his actual presence changes the field.
And where do you notice that inside?
Well, I'm noticing something else that I noticed some joy in my chest. And then now there's like a softening and more tears coming up, like relief, I guess is what it is.
Yeah. Would it be okay to just sit with that for a minute? We can just notice it and allow it to come or not come, right? There's no agenda.
It's so interesting to feel it. And then over here, there's definitely like, I didn't realize how much I have this voice of like who I should be and how I should respond and what it means if I respond one way versus another way. Like, it's just very interesting, like how aware I am of that right now.
Yeah. So you can just notice that too. That's a friendly part. Wants to take care of you.
And if the voice is really close, you can even back it up a little bit until it feels like the right distance for that tape to play, that it feels comfortable.
I notice like different parts of my brain, I want to say like lighting up. Like right here, like I feel like a really clear sensation of here, and then like lower left. it's almost like yeah, it's just interesting. It really feels like different hemispheres are trying to.
Might be interesting to just watch that and see what they do.
The sensation of warmth from the latte is like, there's a comforting and
yeah.
I love bodies. They are so miraculous to me. That's my thought. Now I feel appreciation, like, wow, my body does a lot.
Yeah. And so that was a really fun example of we stepped into the nervous system in a place that was sort of enjoyable, right? And then that expanded to some processing. Some material was moving through. In a session, you know, we could watch that for a while. It would often move into, as you're getting better at just watching what's happening, it would often move to some unpleasant material. And then as the system became more resourced, that unpleasant material would sort of process out. And it'll go up and up and up and then reach what we call a threshold, sort of a peak, and then be done. And then it goes and doesn't come back. And that's the fun part when it leaves and it's done.
That's the magic part.
I was listening to Michael Singer today, who's my favorite teacher.
We are big fans.
Oh, you guys are big fans?
Mm-hmm.
He talked today about, he doesn't usually get into technique, but he got into technique. It was yesterday, technically. But he talked about the idea of, 5% of your brain is trying to control, and then 95% of your brain just has all this old material that comes up in various ways. And I was listening to it thinking, man, this guy, he's just doing SE for your brain, doing SE spiritually, like expanding SE. SE is really, somatic experiencing is really about teaching a person. The first phase is about teaching them how to watch what's happening inside the nervous system. And the next phase is teaching them to get the heck out of the way, right? That's our job. And then we get out of the way, and now all of a sudden my arm's rocking all over the place. And I have clients say, this is really weird. What the heck's going on? This feels, or different stuff's moving.
Basically body impulses and like allowing and being disinhibited around letting body impulses do what they seem to want to do.
Yeah.
Lauren, in case you weren't sure what this was.
Yeah. And as they watch what the body wants to do and the body does it, and then we settle and things kind of settle out. It's pretty neat.
Well, Lauren, it's the same. It's like a different application of the same, I think, belief system that you have around your experience and that we share, which is like that the universe is inviting us into healing. Like it's giving us these opportunities. It's going to like give us an opportunity that's going to remind us of something that wants to heal up, and how much tools and agency and support we have to move through the experience in a different way in that moment can kind of transmute, heal, release, shift us on something, right? Like my mom's going through something right now. She's done the same drama with like all of us kids. And, she's been in a pattern of her whole life. And now she's kind of like, she has some more tools and more awareness and the same patterns happening. And she's like, oh, and she's kind of like getting underneath it and being with it in a different way rather than just bailing on the thing and waiting for it to come up again. And I think our nervous systems are that way too, because when something happens and we feel a sensation or some sort of somatic, body memory is associated with that, oftentimes it's the thing from the past that's wanting to heal, and it's not always conscious. So it might be a body impulse, but we don't even know what that's about. And if we let something complete with the opportunity of the moment from the past, it gets to get released. And then we're not holding it in our system forever and carrying around all of that charge and, dealing with the costs of that. And that was so Greg, I had my really good friend slept over last night. We dated for a short period of time. And then we've been sort of like practice partners, almost good friends, like, but there was a rejection. Like he's the first person that ever broke up with me at 37 years old or something like that. I managed to organize my life somehow to avoid rejection like that. And he was beautiful enough to stick around for me to process it through. And it was pretty clear it wasn't just about him. I mean, stuff about my dad, and it like launched me into NSC, and there was all this stuff. And I mean, it was a blow, man. And especially for like a type 8 to admit how affected we are by being rejected by somebody. There was loads of denial patterns and all of this stuff, right? And so I really worked through that for like deeply from like a lot of different modalities for a year or so. And part of it was he stuck around in the heat of it all. Even when I was like in my projections, he was present for it. So it was that empathetic witness. And sometimes he got triggered, and sometimes we weren't taking turns being triggered, and we were triggered at the same time. But there was a consistency where we were, you know, committed to each other on some level. And I was talking to him about like, there's sort of a mini rejection happening in my romantic life currently, maybe, I guess, kind of. And, you know, I was like, no, but, and I'm saying, well, I don't feel as affected. Like it feels really different. Like I think some of that healed up. And he's like, yeah, but it's not like you're not unaffected by rejection. Like he was kind of like making some room for me to feel my ouch and all that kind of thing, which is beautiful invitation. Yeah. And I was like, but 3 years ago, it felt like I was going to die. It felt like my body was going to break apart. The sensations were actually painful when I would feel how I felt about it, you know, when it went through this first time with him. And so I was sort of appreciating myself for all the charges that aren't there in that same capacity. And I'm not saying now I'm impenetrable and I've conquered rejection and I can never be hurt again. But it does feel a little bit more like it's about the rejection that's happening in the moment, and not every rejection piled on top of each other for the extent of my entire life that's welling up all in one moment or interaction. And that's my experience of somatic experiencing and healing through using.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly. So my favorite, my other favorite spiritual teacher is a guy named David Hawkins. And he talks about the idea of stacks.
Wait, are you talking about the map of consciousness?
Lauren and I have a book club going right now.
Greg, first of all, are you available for new clients? That is my question. Are you taking, and this is not a joke, no pressure.
So we can discuss it offline a little bit if you'd like. My formal response is probably not. I do have a young gal that wants to work for me who do pretty well, but yeah, I'm trying. I can't
believe you just brought that up. We have an evolution of consciousness club around this book right now.
I tell people I moved down in 2006 to work at the Meadows because that's a reasonable thing to tell people. And it's also true. I got an internship, but I came down in January of 2000 or December of 2005. I had seen David Hawkins speak in Chicago earlier that year, and I wanted to see him in Sedona, and I saw him at Sedona. And then in the end of December in 2005, they put all the tickets for his 2006 Sedona appearances on sale at once. And I thought, well, because of my lifestyle at the time, I thought I'm just going to commit to going down one weekend a month and seeing David Hawkins speak every single weekend. I bought them all, and they all sold out in like, I don't know, 2 weeks. And I just happened to catch them, and I got them all. And it was really interesting because for that year, it was this same sort of small crew of people, right? There's 400 seats, 300 seats in that little auditorium. And it was a pretty powerful experience. I mean, it was really, really neat. So yeah, and then when I was down hanging there, I realized, the Meadows is right around the corner. I think I'll swing down there, and they had an internship available. And then I got fired from my job like 5 minutes later. And I called them. They were originally going to take me in the fall. And I called them and I said, can I come now? And I said, sure. So put everything in my car and drove down. But that's the kind of, when I saw that happen with a lot of the folks who would hang out with them, something would happen, everything would fall apart. in their life. And that was, that job was really important to me. It was my identity, obviously my livelihood. Mm-hmm. And it had been 9 years I had spent in that sort of community. And all of a sudden it was gone. Mm-hmm. My only obstacle to coming down. So I was really, and consider myself still to be a student of David Hawkins. I love that work and that material.
What resonates?
I think at the time, one thing I've come to the conclusion, this will be a bit of a bunny trail, but you mind if we go off on a bunny trail for a second?
We love bunny trails.
Okay. So take a second and where do I start? So one of the fun things that I'll do with my clients, I have these clients and they're involved in 12-step groups, and they come in and it's fairly predictable about kind of the objections with the 12-step group. Stanford just did a really cool literature review in 2020. The field of therapy goes back and forth on 12-step groups about every decade. In the 90s and the 80s, up to the 80s, everything was great. Late 80s, early 90s, everybody's like, oh, they're self-selecting. It's not a real thing. In the 2000s, everybody turned it back on again. About 2011, I think, some boys at Harvard published a bunch of stuff, and it's off track. And now Stanford, I think, is just done a big literature review, which I can send you the link to the article I read about it if you want to put it in the notes for the show. But talking about how they tend to be pretty effective. But anyway, the objection, of course, is always around religion. And my conversation with them goes mostly like this. I say, well, what is it? What is a religion? There's religion. So think of somebody in your life. This is just the exercise I do with them. You guys can come along if you wish. But you think of somebody in your life who is religious and spiritual, right? Because I know people who are most of the time, if I'm in a group of people, I'll say, is there a difference between religion and spirituality? And people say, yeah. And I say, well, what do you think is the difference between the two? And so we go down and really think about the definitions of each of them. And I mean, you can imagine the common ones that come up, right? So religion is about, almost all of the people I work with have some level of religious trauma. So we're immediately going to get in a room of, 40 or 50 people in recovery from various addictions. We're immediately going to get the idea that religion's oppressive, that it is, sort of problematic, basically, and all the downsides of religion. And there's a fair number of downsides of religion. And the biggest thing that I talk to folks about is the idea that religion is organized, right? So religion is a group of people who, and then they're exclusive, right? That's also exclusive. Like there's a group of people that commit to a specific, generally some sort of moral code of conduct. It's often fairly loose. They try to define it very tightly, but in practice, it tends to be quite a bit more loose than it's defined. And there are varying levels of religion. More what the word for religions that really stick to these sort of ideas. They tend to be more on the conservative side, right? In the way we define them. And then there's liberal branches of every religion that they're a little less excited about that stuff. Mm-hmm. And then spirituality obviously is a little bit different. What do you guys think? I should ask you, actually. It's probably more interesting to listen to if we have a conversation. So what do you guys think is the difference between religion and spirituality?
I think that spirituality, well, for me, is our perception of experiences that we can't use our five senses to understand.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
And I think about religion as kind of a doctrine, the doctrine of someone who, or some group that's tried to understand those experiences and then kind of committed to that as the truth of that experience, said, okay, this is
eloquent.
Yeah.
Lauren's good about eloquence on things like that. One of genius, I think, for you.
Yeah, I think so. When we're getting into it, religion, the way I get back to it with the clients is the conclusion. I really like David Hawkins, actually, I think said, religion is the study, or science is the study of the measurable and the repeatable. You know what I mean? And when it falls outside of that realm, then we're generally going to get into spirituality. Mm. And the point I make with the clients, because I really let them put all the attributes up there that fit. And I say, well, the biggest thing that we see with the spiritual attributes, as I've done the exercise over the years, is spirituality is inherently subjective. And what that means is kind of like, I know it when I see it, and I know it when I'm experiencing it, but I can't really communicate it to you, until you've been there too, right? It's a subjective experience. It's not measurable. It's not studyable. That's for certain. We can't, it's like there's a whole realm of the human experience that's not sort of able to be quantified. And spirituality tends to be that. And then religion, I really like, Lauren's definition. What Lauren is saying makes a lot of sense to me. And I just always said religion is a system of values and beliefs around which people structure their lives in a community, right? So just a system of values and beliefs that we can all agree on. Hey, if we do this, and it gets back to what we were talking about earlier, Lauren, when you're talking about living in community. Well, living in community is actually can be fairly terrifying in the beginning if you don't understand the parameters. And so religion, I think, in part, the purpose of and value of religion historically is that it just gave us a box of parameters that we can all kind of move along from, right? We all need a little bit of structure so we don't have to spend so much time trying to figure out, like, is Lauren my friend or is she going to eat me? We have this structure, this set of beliefs in common that we agreed upon, and then we can kind of move forward and do more complex things. But anyway, so a system of values and beliefs around which I structure my life is the direction that I go as far as the religion piece goes. And so then I'll talk to the clients and say, we'll come back to this in a minute. And I'll talk about the idea. I can't remember the study. There was a study, I think around 07 or 08, that talked about the different regions where a particular religion had the most prominent impact on the culture. Mm-hmm. And in the study, I think the East Coast was sort of a blend of Judaism and Catholicism, right? With New York and New Jersey being really focused on the Judaism and sort of greater East Coast, more Catholic. The South, of course, would be the sort of the evangelical piece, would have the religion that would have the greatest impact on the culture. And then the Wild West, as a general rule, is pretty a-religious, interestingly enough. And then when you got to California, it was, and I'll say, well, what do you think it's in California? And they'll throw out a bunch of the traditional mainline religions. Say, well, no, according to this particular study, they just call it New Age, right? So New Age was sort of a blanket that they put over that. And what was really interesting to me with this particular study is the predominant cultural religion of the Pacific Northwest. Any guesses?
Mm-mm. Witchcraft?
New Age? Right.
No. Well, this particular study, I wish I could find it. This particular study said that the predominant cultural religion of the Pacific Northwest was environmentalism.
Mm.
And this is published in 07 or 08, right? And at that time in particular, it's still this way, but at that time in particular, they were just starting to do things like outlaw plastic bags at the grocery store. Mm-hmm. The culture was, the culture on the East Coast was very, very focused on environmentalism. And it was really a culture that way. And I thought, well, how interesting that could be a religion.
But it's a framework. It's a structure to figure out how you're going to make decisions, and
It's a system of values and beliefs. A system of values and beliefs around which I structure my life and my community. Yeah. And so then I would say the other thing I like to do from an attachment perspective is I talk to folks and say, think about the first time you got high. Or if you're a behavioral addict, the first time you engage in your behavior and had the payoff, right? Everybody who has an addiction has an experience. So sometimes the first time you get high, you just get paranoid and run away. But the first time you got high and had that experience, mm-hmm. right? How did you feel? And we go down the list. And you guys, we can do this together too. Like if you guys think about the first time you got high, how did you feel?
Very powerful and very...
Or drunk, by the way. I mean, we're substance, we're open-ended on substances.
I'm thinking about
powerful is a good one.
Well, I'm thinking about my first MDMA journey. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Can I write these down? Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay. Working session. I felt powerful I felt really aligned and in tune with myself.
Yeah.
I felt like a lack of resistance to my own experience. I felt like high capacity around holding like a non-judgmental field for people in my life, experiences I've had, even for myself, and maybe how hard I'd been on myself and in my life.
Like available.
Yeah, I felt very available.
Those are good ones.
And a lot of really positive body sensations as well.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like fun.
Mm-hmm.
And how about for you, Lauren, the first time you had an experience of getting high, or if your drug of choice is sex, you can think about your first experience with your first positive sexual experience.
Well, what I'm thinking about, I actually did love and sex addiction and really associated a lot with
relationship stuff.
Yeah, relationships. And so when I think about sex, I actually enjoy that less, like in terms of the high, it's the, or have over it's the physical touch. That, it's like connection and feeling like a part of something, feeling like I belong, feeling, I guess resourced, held.
I like that
physically
actually.
And emotionally.
That one doesn't come up in the treatment center quite as often, but it's really good. Resourced, held. Loved.
Yeah. Or cared for. I mean, like I think there's ranges of love, but I felt cared for and seen, I guess, like that.
Yeah.
You would only touch me if there was something that you are attracted to or interested in, right? And
and I can certainly relate to that. I always talk about the core. I'm an affirmation addict. That's the real crux of and mine was probably more of a sex and love addiction. Held emotionally and physically is such a powerful one. For me, a lot of it was about feeling affirmed and feeling a sense of and being good enough. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the other things I always hit with my guys and gals is being so less, and we can include fear, shame, pain, guilt, what am I missing? Anger, etc. Basically less of the core unpleasant emotions generally is what happens when a person gets high, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how we wind up with. Now, the thing is I have this underneath this DOC here, right? Drug of choice.
I see. Yeah.
So we were talking before, and I talked about how when I was young, I knew a lot of people who were very, very religious, and actually grew up in a sort of a crotchety, cranky religious environment. With my greater community, it was very, I didn't find it to be particularly helpful. But later, when I reconciled with that part of my life, I discovered that a lot of that had to do with me. But I also knew some people who were religious and spiritual. And then I knew some people who were spiritual, right? Because you can be spiritual and not religious. And so at this point I say, well, let's take a second and describe all the people in your life. You can think of somebody in your life who is spiritual, and maybe they're spiritual and religious, or maybe they're just spiritual, right? In my case, spiritual and religious. My mom is very spiritual and very religious, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll take the DOC thing and we'll just change it to HP. So think about somebody in life who has a higher power and is affiliated with some sort of religious organization in a positive way. Now, there's always negative attached to it too, but in a positive way. Do they feel more powerful? Sorry about the background noise here. Can you guys hear that or not?
Just a little. It's okay.
Okay. Do they feel more powerful? Yep. They feel more aligned. Not 100% sure about that, but it seems reasonable. A lack of resistance to growth. Again, maybe not perfect. Welcome, connection, belonging, resourced, right? We get on the line and I say, folks, well, look, we get on this line and everybody, and actually there's a bunch of empirical data that would support this idea too. Do I need to pause the background info or not with the background noise?
Well, I feel like, no, I just lost you around like, so you're saying that people with a higher power you're saying the empirical data shows that they have these things, like when they have the balance of spirituality and religion?
Well, you can't actually measure spirituality, right? But what you can do is you can take a look at, and again, these are studies that are done, in some of them are a little bit on the older side. So I don't know how valid this is in the culture now. But back in the day, you could measure folks who were religious and practice their religion, certain period, with varying degrees. And you could say, oh, look, they're more likely to report. Now, again, we don't know to tell them the truth, right? But we know that they report that they have less levels of shame, that they have higher amounts of satisfaction.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Fewer incidences of divorce, fewer incidences of, things like that. So the data tends to back that up as far as that conclusion. And so the thing I'll tell my folks a lot of the time is I say, hey, you don't, I don't have a real dog in the fight in terms of the higher power you land on. You just picked the wrong one. The other thing I tell them is I say, y'all work the steps already. You turn your will and your life over to heroin the first time you tried it. You came to believe that heroin could restore you to sanity.
Oh, okay. I'm following now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Jonathan Peugeot?
No.
He's sort of like a Orthodox. I don't know if he's a minister, but he's like a thinker and philosopher. And my friend that stayed over last night, this morning, we watched a video. This is the type of stuff we do for fun. I was watching a video of him talking about Dante's Inferno. And what he's trying to do is reconcile sort of modernity and religion in a historical sense and spirituality to some extent. And he was talking about, that it's a metaphor for where we are now, and that people are on all different kind of states of consciousness or states of experience, heaven and hell and purgatory and all these things. And to summarize what he was saying is that on some level, love is driving all of that. And so even if you love how you feel when you take heroin, that can drive you into a more hellacious experience. And there's different ways that you engage with that. You can love a person or exercise or service, but either way, it's the thing that drives us towards something. And that there's basically this high side and low side with how we interact with that in our consciousness, I guess. And that, even if you love a person, there's a way where you can, from whichever state of consciousness you're loving them from, I suppose, wanting to move towards them, you might go down in consciousness to get towards the thing you love because of the payoff. And that there's even this weird thing in the suffering, what you're saying, the payoff, there's a mixture of suffering and anticipation of the payoff that is a little bit enjoyable in the suffering, even the longing of a relationship that's unrequited or something like that. And then you get the payoff, and it lasts for however long it lasts or whatever, but that on some level, love is driving us. And, he gave a lot of different descriptions of it. I thought it was fascinating. And he talked
really
about
interesting.
all different.
Well, I really align to that too. And it's one of the reasons that I love the map of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because that is I would almost say my experience, but also my awareness.
Exactly.
Is that and that love is happening at all those levels, but we're meeting it right at the vibration or the calibration that we're available for. And there's something else that you said. So I'm going to detour, but come back because it's connected. Yeah. So in the work I do in the world right now a big part of it is running wide affinity spaces. And those spaces, though, the program that we've curated is a mixture of spirituality. There's a spiritual perspective. There's also a little bit of somatics in it in terms of getting people into their bodies, because race is so highly intellectualized. And I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Resma Menakem, the Black somatic therapist who wrote Grandmother's Hands. And his theory is that the reason
I've heard a lot about the book.
Yeah. The reason that racism hasn't shifted is because we are approaching it intellectually, and it's a body trauma. And so his book, Grandmother's Hands, actually gives all these somatic experiencing exercises for people to do. And
beautiful.
Yeah. So we're very connected, I think. And I'm saying all that to say that we talk about the highest expression of healing around racism is liberation. And liberation, we built out kind of a continuum that's like white supremacy culture and equitable culture, equity, and then liberation being beyond that. And a huge shift between equitable culture and liberation is, we don't say it this way, but it's really the belief in a higher power. It's really trusting something greater than you, trusting the community. And I've incorporated a lot of my experience in 12-step in terms of, right, what do I understand about when we surrender to group conscience and things like that. And we also talk about helping people use their body sensations to identify if they're in the lower levels of the map of consciousness. And we actually teach the map of consciousness like the first day.
That's really neat.
Yeah. So I'm wanting to like tie the threads together, even for myself, of what we're saying, because I think basically we're pointing to principles that in all of our work support like the healing and the highest actualization, right, of physical bodies and people and humans. And what I hear us, one of the things I hear us pointing to is, especially with this last exercise, is we almost require a belief in something greater than ourselves, but what we choose matters. Is that what you're saying?
Because I probably could have saved us 10 minutes of talking just by saying that too. You know, we just gotten to it. But,
well, and there's
exactly what you choose has an incredible effect on the trajectory of your life.
Well, and a lot of modern spirituality, this is something I also talk about with my friend, is like about kind of self-empowerment and like what works for me. And there's there's even this postmodern movement of like, just like, well, if it doesn't work for me, I'm going to get out of it, or I'm going to change it, or I'm going to do something different. And it's very much about, well, what's my experience, and am I having a pleasurable experience almost, and using all these tools in service of that. And, he's older than me. And he kind of was brought up in that. And, primarily he's thought about relationships that way. And it's like, well, if it's not working, I break up and you find something new. And he's just like, doesn't work. That doesn't, like, he's like, it's not working. And he, the idea being, it's actually not working for the collective either. And so, that it's interesting because there's sort of this, it is the spiritual movement, but sometimes without a higher power or that structure. And then that, you almost can use similar tools to sort of like attach more deeply to your own ego identity and have an easier life without any meaning beyond that. But what is it? Like, why are we here? And what do you pick for what you believe in that's outside of yourself? Lauryn and I both have religious trauma, and I was raised Christian and had some experiences with that where I kind of deconstructed it and threw the baby out with the bathwater. And lately I've just had so much interest, mostly in some people in my life who embody Christianity in a way that I find very inspiring and appealing and aligned. And so I'm kind of revisiting a lot of it and noticing that it's all the same. Like just, all kinds of things like that. But what is your sense of like, why are we here? And even with the goal of healing or service or highest selves, like there are still egoic parts of what drives us as human beings, like these desires, like pleasure and status and power and wealth, that's all intertwined and in there too. So it's, it sounds like we're talking about agape and how do we like stand for that? And it's like, as a human being to just be that is like, it's a big challenge to do. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know anybody who is in that. So what's your take on like, how do we actually stand for what is with the higher power, stand for healing and this sort of development in this direction, and contend with all of that?
Boy, that's like my probably the favorite question I've been asked in like 3 years. I'm just really excited about that because it's just so rewarding to have, my undergraduate degree. I grew up, in a Christian church as well. And then I went on tour. I auditioned for a music group that had a dance troupe. It was all men. And
I love this story so much.
About 2/3 of them were gay. And I got on the tour and I looked around and I was like, well, these aren't bad guys. Because I had not been knowingly exposed. There was tons of gay people in high school, but I didn't know any of them. And they certainly weren't about to walk up to me and be like, man, Greg, let me tell you about what's going on with me right now. I mean, it was a pretty rough deal to be gay when we were kids, And so I got back and I went to, they call themselves a Christian school. I don't think that there's several criteria by which I'm not confident that they meet the meet the criteria. And so I have an undergraduate degree in religion, and I got it mostly so I could argue with my religious community and win. I mean, you talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I was just really excited. And I would do that there at school. But it was really interesting because when I was around people at school, there were sort of three sort of broad types of people that went to the school with us. There was folks who were, the school was very academically renowned. So about 1/3 of the students, I think, were just there to go do pre-med and pre-law and kind of move on with their life. And then there's 1/3 of them who were religious and who were kind of cranky about it. And there's 1/3 of them who were religious and who were really nice people. I mean, just like genuinely happy. Certainly happier than me. Like not, there was no question in my mind that I thought, And so I got the degree so I could argue with people who were religious and cranky. And I wouldn't say I had a good time. It felt good at the time, but in the process, of course, I really broke apart and collapsed my entire belief systems about the world around me. I mean, really just demolished everything. So it facilitated that experience that I talked about earlier, going to see a therapist and him saying, maybe there's some compulsive sexual behavior here, and in the process of college, I did what everybody does at college. And not what everybody does. I did what I did at college, which was to sleep with anyone and everyone I could be near to. But the problem I had is I would eventually involve myself with people who were pretty nice. And as soon as things weren't rose petals and butterflies, I'd cheat. And then eventually got to a point where I would cheat no matter what. Didn't matter how close this person conformed to my idea of what attractive was. Didn't matter how kind or gentle or how wild and crazy they were in the sack. There just was it got to a point where there was no option. And that's really what comes up for me when I look at the culture now. It's so interesting. I know for a fact that if I were 21 today, I probably would just roll through that process. And what I remember is how lonely I was. I had a lot of what the world told me would be pretty fun. MTV said it would be fun to sleep with lots of people. And I was on the football team in college and drank a lot of beer and ran around. I don't think I've ever been particularly socially adept, but I had some friends and I had all the stuff that it seemed like it would work. And I just got lonelier and lonelier and lonelier. And to me, I think a lot of that had to do with coming unhinged from the belief that there was something bigger than me, and also having a really deep confusion about the difference between pleasure and happiness, right? There's a significant difference between pleasure and happiness. And so I think of spirituality as the idea that I am seeking something. When I eventually came back, the challenge I had is I got to a point where I was no longer cheating on people. And I even got to a point where I could have a relationship with somebody. And even if we had a fight, I could show up a little bit. So conflict avoidant. Still really working on that now. But even in the context of all that, I kept falling in love with these attractive Christian girls. Very inconvenient for I was Buddhist, and I really a follower of David Hawkins, who's an Advaita Hindu. So it's really inconvenient. And what I realized, and so then I would go back to these churches, and I would have a very different experience in the church compared to what I read about in my sort of religion. So my religion department was, I would say, as a whole, very angry as well. It was really easy to find the material about the injustices of religion. But when I sat in this experience, it was like, wow, these are actually these are just a bunch of people trying the best they can. It's just a bunch of schmoes doing exactly what I'm doing, trying the best they can. So anyway, to round out back to the question, what does it mean? That was really, that's been my question and my quest probably from about the age of 18 or 19. I think I figured out what it doesn't mean. And what it doesn't mean.
Place to start.
Yeah, what it doesn't. Tom Clancy. I think I got this out of a Tom Clancy book. I read it, I think when I was like 14, but I don't remember for sure. He talked about this idea. It was really interesting. He talked about the idea in the 1970s, in this, or it may be a real article that actually happened. One of the two. Not at all confident about which is which. But in the 1970s, the CIA with their international agents had figured out a way to get them to the point where they just wouldn't crack. If you caught them and tortured them, no matter what you did to them, they wouldn't tell you what they knew. So the KGB had to get kind of creative and think of something different, right? And so what they ended up doing is they had this agent they really wanted to extract some information in, and they brought him in and did the normal 2 or 3 days of beating them up and causing them a lot of physical discomfort and saying, tell us what you know. And it didn't work like usual. And so they got to the end, and the guy pulled out a gun and put it to the guy's face and said, if you don't tell me what I want to know, I'm going to kill you. And at the same time, he'd been sort of doped up on sodium pentothal and all the truth-telling serums and all the different things you can put into somebody so he's attached to an IV, right? Well, unbeknownst to him, somebody has put some stuff in the IV that is going to knock him unconscious in a second, right? Guy says, no, I'm not going to tell you. The interrogator pulls the trigger. So boom, boom, boom. And after that, things fade to black because they inject him. There's blanks in the gut. It doesn't actually kill him, but they inject him with enough stuff to have him lose consciousness. So he wakes up in a sensory deprivation chamber. So in the sensory deprivation chamber, it's all black. You're in salt water that's buoyant. Basically, the body doesn't go up or down. Your buoyancy is perfect because you're completely immersed in salt water. And I think maybe they clipped the spinal cord or did something so you're paralyzed. Maybe it was with drugs. Maybe they did it physically. I don't know. So you wake up, it's all black, and there's just nothing. And as far as you know, you're dead.
Yeah.
And the good ones lasted 2 minutes. They cracked they cracked open and would say anything they wanted to as soon as a voice came on the PA that would talk to them. Why? Because that's unimaginable. The idea of the presence of myself and the absence of all else, I think, is very reasonably defined as hell. Right? The presence of self for a perception of eternity. And eternity comes fast when you don't have hope. You know what I mean? When you really think you're by yourself, no one's coming, somebody just shot me, I'm dead, and this is it. So to me, I think if that is the closest definition of hell that I could come up with, then it would stand to reason that the opposite of hell, heaven, would be the opposite. So the absence of self and the presence of all else. And so one of the things that happened is my junior year, I took a class on Buddhism, and I read, in stark contrast to all these angry, reforming, sort of anti-religious people I was reading in my other classes, I read a little book by Thich Nhat Hanh, right? And when I would read this material, I would find myself settling. My nervous system settled. I didn't know that at the time. And I thought, wow, there must be something here. And everything I would do with reading Buddhist material would have me settle and move me more toward a place of peace. And so that's why I decided that must have some merit to it. And when you look at this idea of enlightenment, one fun part about looking into that area is you discover that nobody really knows what the hell it is. It's just this idea. But if you really deconstruct it, for me, I think it might be the absence of self and the presence of all else. So then the other thing I did after that am I making sense so far? I like to check in every once in a while.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why Christ consciousness or agape love or service resonate for people who are sort of on that path and interested in what you're talking about. And then also just like our humanness, like this dualistic experience where we have our limitations and we aren't necessarily attaining that enlightenment and sainthood and, skew of self in service of others and, or in the presence of others or whatever. And availability, it's like, it's a tall order.
Well, and that's the other thing is they all seem to indicate that it's a long-term process.
Yeah.
I was at the off. Go ahead.
In the Map of Consciousness, the book, have you read that particular book?
I have. I think I started that one. I've read the other ones. That's the newest one.
Yeah, and some of it isn't written directly by him. It's like a compilation but what I really appreciate is one, hearing about David Hawkins' spirituality, because I wasn't aware of it. But as they go up the map of consciousness, like they basically divide it and they're like, here's the bliss state, and they give characteristics of, the different states. And, basically the higher vibrational consciousness states are what we would associate with ideas of enlightenment or like loss of self, right? Loss of ego. So I'm just over here processing, like, do I align? Does that match for me what you're saying? And like, what is my heaven and what is my hell? And how I do think there are, and then I'm listening to Bethany talk about these agape, Christ conscious, these love. And what feels true for me is in those higher levels of consciousness, just as some, we could say as the lower levels, like there's principles of what we want and how we experience reality. At each level of consciousness, it has its own flavor, texture. And that, for those of us, especially who are on a journey of seeking, there's definitely a preference. And in the map of consciousness, they talk about like lower not being better or worse than higher, and reincarnation, and also the percent of people that tend to stay in lower vibrations and how few calibrate up, and how long it takes for most people to, as you're saying, to calibrate up. But as I was reading it, I was like, I definitely have a preference for these states, certain states over others, which then also I think leads back to addiction, because my experience of MDMA journeys or physical touch, sex, food, the things, drugs, the things that we get addicted to, I think they're just like a taste of heaven, right? Like it's almost like trying to get to that higher state of consciousness without taking the journey.
Yeah, Hawkins actually says that. I don't know if that's in the book or not, but it's beautiful.
I haven't read. There's a whole chapter on 12-step actually that I haven't read yet in that book. Oh, really?
So he talks about the idea that what happens is when I drink the alcohol, like if the sun, if God is the sun, and anxiety and fear and pain and all these other things are clouds, right? I drink some alcohol and it gets me literally high, right? It gets me high above the clouds. And all of a sudden I have a direct experience of the sun. But then the karmic consequence of having believed that the alcohol caused that, it causes me to drop a little bit lower every time. And that's the spiritual experience of tolerance, right? Yeah. And that's what, then in 2002, I think I read Power versus Force by David Hawkins, and I was like, wait a minute. And it took all this stuff because I had explored, basically, I didn't spend much time with Islam, but I dug into Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism, well, parts Hinduism. Hinduism's pretty broad, and Buddhism, and was trying to figure out where they overlapped, right? Fun fact, did you know they had a Buddhist Reformation in the 12th century that parallels the Christian Reformation in the 15th century really, really closely? Maybe it was the 11th century. I can't remember.
That makes a lot of sense to me, though. Sense. Yeah. It's like a collective journey on the map of consciousness, like with a flavor and a cultural, like, you know.
Yeah, it's almost like there's like a timeline for each religion. If you look at Muhammad put together Islam at 700, I think, AD. And if you look at 700 years ago, Christianity was doing there was a whole sect of Christianity that was pretty cranky, right? A lot of rough stuff going on there in different parts of it. So,
well, it makes me think about astrology too, and just cycles and seasons and patterns and countries after a certain amount of time, 200-year cycles and like revolution. And it's there's so much patterning to all the systems,
right?
Almost in a predictable way.
Yeah. So yeah, then I got into the David Hawkins material in my early 20s, and I was like, oh, this makes sense. And through that, I eventually reapproached Christianity as well. I helped a guy out here plant a church and was involved in that for several years, and had very much, I love, I'm kind of a mutt spiritually. There aren't a lot of people I can have a conversation with about it because, the combination of the two, it tends to blend kind of the left and the right. So it's going to be very confusing, but it sounds like, you're kind of in a similar space, Bethany, as far as the direction.
We're tracking.
Well, you look at go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have to hat tip my friend because he spends a lot of time in these questions and in these inquiries, and then we chat about it. And then I got all the benefit of like the 15 books that he read and the 27 hours of YouTubes that he watched. And then he's like, this idea. And then we get to talk about it. But yeah, it's very interesting to me, especially when I'm in this moment of like, what are my highest values and how do I want to organize my energy and what do I want to commit to and focus on? What are my own limitations? They're potent questions.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded the Zen teacher that I talked about earlier. He gave a talk one time, and it always stuck with me. It's probably the only thing he talked about that I remember. But he said, my friend is Christian, and I explained to him about karma in multiple lifetimes and the idea of working off your karma over time. And actually, in traditional Buddhist understanding, you work off your negative and your positive karma. You have to get to like 0 somehow. So it's really, there's a lot to it.
Well, I hear Lauren talk about karma a lot.
What was that, Lauren talked about karma a lot?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure.
Well, it makes me think about too what you were saying, Greg, about like somatics. Like I feel like we're actually coming full circle to a certain extent, because you talked about somatics being, there's a word you used about like releasing all the stuff, like getting out of the way. So what the releasing of the material, I think is the word you kept using, like the old material. And that somatics is like that, in the body, but that there's this whole other thing that happens in the spirit is what I heard you say, or pointing to, that maybe that we don't necessarily integrate that into our conversation about the body.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say I was capturing that?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the body work is deeply spiritual. I don't think the two are necessarily disconnected.
Because I believe that there's like an energetic quantum field that when we call our enlightenment is like our journey to find the place where we are not self and where we are connected to everything, which you can call light body, you can call the quantum field. And that if we're just light and energy and matter, and that becomes matter, that there's all this ways that energy is stuck in that energetic field, and that our body is the form in which we get to see it and feel it to clear the field. So if we use karma,
that's so cool. That's such an interesting idea.
Like if we use karma as an example, and we are eternal in that space, then all of the lifetimes, the places where we have incompletions or out of integrity that occur in our field are getting pushed into form as traumas, as incompletions in the body. And that it's like outside in, inside out. Like I can clear what's in the body and that's clearing my field, or I can clear what's in the field and that's going to manifest in the experience of my body.
That's really interesting. That's really, I just have a lot of resonance with what you said there.
Yeah. And I love somatics for that reason, but also, which is a phrase I love, of moving to non-duality, but also. I think that just like we can over-identify with the self, we can over-identify with the body.
Yeah.
And that the body is just pointing to other levels of awareness, like other dimensions of awareness of the truth of who we are. And so if we start to follow the sensations and follow the emotions and find the energetic field behind that, and then the way that we are light moving through time and space behind that, that there's a level of conscious awareness where we heal ourselves as light outside of time and space. And then get to, feel the benefits of that as matter in a physical body. But so like, I feel like somatics is the beginning, and I could see that you could stop there or you could stay there and never fully become aware of. And it goes back to that integration that I feel like I'm pointing to, but I feel like there's an energetic something in you pointing to it also, is that, if we integrated religion and spirituality, if we integrated somatic spirituality, if we saw and practiced the healing in this more integrative way, and our quote unquote, let's say, goal was to guide people to that heaven space where we're out, away from hell, which is the obsession with self, and that all we can see is self and isolation. And that healing is guiding people to that space where we are not the self and we are everything. And like how all those tools work together.
Yeah. And they work together in part because there's a direction, right? And that, I think, when I run into one thing I'm grateful for in terms of the teachings of David Hawkins is just the map, like an idea of a direction.
Right.
That's what facilitated that bottom for me, was like, I don't know what the heck to do with myself now.
Right. That's a great point. Like if there's no direction, it's not dissimilar from being that person in the sensory deprivation tank. Right. It's like, well, this is all there is anyway.
Yeah. And I think you see so I've been thinking a lot lately about, healing. And I think it would be so interesting to approach collective healing the same way we approach individual healing, right? You would never tell somebody, what you did when you were 12. That was, you really need to feel a lot of shame about that. We're not going to wouldn't do that with a client, right? But we do that collectively. Like we take the sins of our past and we really give ourselves a hassle for them. And that's, I can't remember exactly why, but that's what your sentence made me think of. That is like, how do we approach, that's the subtext of the podcast, right? How do we approach healing?
Right. I was about to say, you're ending where we always end, which is like, so how does this apply to collective healing?
Right. Yeah. And I think what you're seeing, before we had a map and we've decided we don't like the map. About 2015 or so, everybody was like, yep, well, map, we're done. And they've been moving that direction for a while. And now we're seeing what happens when there's not much of a map. What do we do? I don't know the answer. I know that I think it's really interesting to see the religion of the culture changing. People say the culture is not religious anymore, and I would disagree. Right? The culture has
the religion is changing.
Oh, the religion of the culture changed.
I was thinking about how capitalism is our religion collectively.
Some truth to that. That's changing too, right? You're seeing a lot more of the socialist ideas coming up strong within the culture now, right? You're seeing a lot of this, the identity. So whenever a culture becomes secularized, ideology becomes the religion. Is what we've seen historically, right? And that's.
You made me think of something, and I'm trying to find it. The thought. You were saying, you talked about. Maybe I'm adding this because maybe you didn't say this, but what I was thinking about was, you were talking about, what I heard was stepping into the unknown, like where we don't have the map. And I'm like, oh, wow, this could be another hour. So I've got to find a way not to make it that. But have you studied Joseph Campbell and the Hero's Journey?
So I've never read the book, but I've studied,
You're familiar
it gets
with
talked about a lot, and I've seen derivative work of it. Yeah.
Because one of my favorite quotes by him is like, if you can see the path in front of you, it's not your path. And, his kind of individual idea of individual, like the myth of the individual is that we're just following other people's path and programming it until we realize that and become aware of that, and then step into our own path, which is an unknown path. And that is actually the beginning of the hero's journey. And that is the story of this life, And so when you talked about stepping into the unknown collectively, I'm like, well, maybe it's time collectively for the hero's journey as a collective, and how much that requires. Well, it's a paradox. It requires and it reveals, in my experience, that there is something bigger than us, which takes us out of the obsession of self, that everything is up to us and our choices when we come to the end of everything that's known, and we're forced to just step into what is not known and see if something else, like the same intelligence that created this planet and made it the perfect distance away from the sun, has the intelligence to curate our individual and collective lives.
Yeah.
And another quote I love by Joseph Campbell is that the purpose of life is to match your nature, lowercase n, with nature, capital N, and your heartbeat with the heartbeat of the universe. And I believe that the hero's journey takes us on kind of a path where we get energetically aligned to the same fabric that is driving evolution, that causes a bud to blossom, that same energy, our body, soul, spirit can get in alignment with that and be guided by that. And so I'm curious if that is where evolution is taking us collectively.
Well, let's hope, because the alternative isn't, if you look at history, the alternative isn't that much fun.
I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful. I feel like, I know we're going to spiral, but my sense is we're blossoming, we're moving into that. Evolution is always learning about itself and expanding itself. And there are contractions within that, but I think especially that my sense is that the evolution will lead to a more heart-opened version of the human and the collective human. And that trauma actually is one of the greatest gifts to us evolving in that direction. The vigilance of our trauma has created so many sensations, so many different it's expanded this system, right? It's expanded the system's ability and awareness in so many different ways. And then it's actually driving us towards, as we heal our trauma, it's driving us more towards relationality, which then is going to drive us more towards heart opening.
Experiencing the trauma collectively is part of the pressure of creating a different experience, because the pain of that is so big that it's moving us. I just see that with the Somatic Experiencing Institute, it's exploding. There's so many people that are interested in it. That's my sense of it, that it's becoming very popular and really on an upswing, because you do it a couple times and you're like, oh, I get it. I get how
logarithmic growth. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's sort of, there's a very exponential growth with people who are interested in healing this way and supporting others in healing this way.
Well, even in our own lives, the way that our trauma has driven us to expand our awareness around religion, and even a smaller example is, the level that I can feel other human beings is directly tied to the level that I had to be vigilant in my environment growing up. And now you know what I'm saying? But now I'm exponentially more connected to the emotional experience of others. So then when I learn somatic experiencing are these different tools, and I can hold my nervous system, but I still have that skill, that's a more evolved human system.
It's higher capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we get back to Joseph Campbell and kind of the wounded healer and that idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Full circle.
I'll be interested to see. Yeah. Full circle again. I'll be interested to see how it goes. I hope your direction takes off. Right now I look at Google News and I see articles on civil war just being randomly thrown around.
Well, this is where I'll end with our last 3 minutes, because this feels really important. So Adrienne Marie Brown has a quote that I'm not going to say exactly right, but she's basically like, we're living in the imagination of people who thought that an environmental crisis and, oppression were appropriate costs for their power and the vision that they had for society. So like when people envisioned America, as an example, originally, like oppressing other people, environmental destruction was an appropriate cost for the vision of capitalism that we live in today. And what I see, and this is why I think the map of consciousness is so important, is that if we are creators of our reality, if we can envision, if we're all envisioning the worst case scenario from a vibrational consciousness of fear, anger, pride, envy, we're going to create that. We're likely going to create that. If we can shift our awareness into these higher states of consciousness, acceptance, willingness, peace, harmony, and we can envision a world like that, we're likely to create that. And we're living in the collective imagination of people who lived hundreds of years before us. Some of the things we experience are things that they wished for. I mean, hot water is an example. Like a very simple example, like that was probably imagined.
Hundreds and thousands of those, right?
Right. So I think that actually part of the issue is that because of the news and the social media, there's a way that our awareness is brought into fear, and that expands. And so the more that we heal our nervous systems, the more that we do this work and we shift what our awareness is on, I think we can start to hold the belief that life could be peaceful, harmonious, and safe. And then we start to create that. And then nervous systems are part of the journey to that.
Well, guys, thank you so much for letting me hang out with you for a couple hours today. I sure enjoyed our time. And
me too.
Thank you for the support. Thank you.
Yeah.
Third time was a charm on scheduling, but we did it.
We got it done.
Thank you for being here, Greg.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye, Greg.
Thanks for listening. We welcome your feedback. You can email us at healingcollectivepod@gmail.com. Our website is thehealingcollectivepodcast.com, at Healing Podcast on Twitter, at Healing Collective Podcast on Instagram. Special thanks to Ethan Luck, who produces. You can find him at Ethan Luck on all platforms.